Prince Alexander walked slowly through the beautiful palace gardens on a warm spring morning. The sun was shining brightly and birds were singing in the tall oak trees. He loved these quiet moments before his daily lessons began. The palace was always busy with servants, advisors, and visitors, but early morning was his peaceful time. As he walked past the rose garden, something caught his attention. Near the main gate, he saw one of the royal guards swaying slightly. The guard was trying to stand straight, but Alexander could tell something was wrong. The man's face was pale and sweat was running down his forehead despite the cool morning air. Alexander had seen this guard many times before. His name was Thomas, and he had been protecting the palace for over 10 years. Thomas was known for being strong and reliable. He never complained and always did his job perfectly. Seeing him struggle was very unusual. The prince moved closer, hiding behind a large fountain so Thomas wouldn't notice him. He watched as the guard gripped his spear tighter, trying to stay steady. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then forced himself to stand tall again. But Alexander could see the pain in his face. Other guards were walking around the palace grounds, but none of them seemed to notice Thomas's struggle. Everyone was focused on their own duties. The morning shift change wouldn't happen for another 2 hours, which meant Thomas had to keep standing there, no matter how he felt. Alexander's mind raced with questions. Was Thomas sick? Was he injured? Why wasn't he asking for help? The prince had been taught that royal guards were trained to never show weakness, but this seemed different. This looked like real pain, not just tiredness. The young prince remembered his father, the king, always saying that a good ruler must care for all his people, especially those who serve and protect the kingdom. Thomas had been protecting Alexander's family for years, standing guard in rain, snow, and burning sun. He deserved help if he needed it. Alexander decided he couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But he also knew he had to be careful. If Thomas was trying to hide his problem, there might be a good reason. Maybe he was afraid of losing his job, or maybe he didn't want to worry anyone. The prince thought about his options. He could tell his father immediately, but that might get Thomas in trouble. He could call for the palace doctor, but that would draw attention and embarrass the guard. Or he could approach Thomas directly and try to help quietly. As Alexander stood behind the fountain, thinking about what to do, he noticed something else. Thomas's hand was shaking as he held his spear. The guard kept looking around nervously as if he was afraid someone would notice his condition. This made Alexander even more concerned. The palace bells rang, signaling that breakfast time was approaching. Soon the gardens would be filled with servants and nobles starting their daily activities. If Thomas collapsed in front of everyone, it would be much worse for him than getting help now. Alexander made his decision. He would approach Thomas carefully and offer help without making a big scene. The prince had always been taught to be brave and kind, and this was a perfect chance to practice both qualities. He stepped out from behind the fountain and walked slowly toward the gate. Thomas saw him coming and immediately tried to stand even straighter, despite his obvious discomfort. The guard's training was so strong that he was still trying to look perfect, even though he was clearly suffering. "Good morning, Thomas," Alexander said in a friendly voice, trying to sound casual. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas replied, his voice a bit shaky but still respectful. Alexander could see now that Thomas was much worse than he had first thought. The guard's uniform was damp with sweat, and his breathing was quick and shallow. His face had a gray color that worried the prince very much. "Thomas, are you feeling well?" Alexander asked gently. The guard hesitated for a moment. Alexander could see him fighting between his duty to never admit weakness and his obvious need for help. The prince waited patiently, hoping Thomas would trust him enough to tell the truth. I'm fine, Your Highness," Thomas finally said, but his voice was weak and unconvincing. Alexander knew Thomas was not fine at all, but he also understood why the guard was reluctant to admit it. The prince realized this was going to be more complicated than he had first thought. He needed to find a way to help Thomas without making him feel ashamed or afraid of losing his position. Alexander looked at Thomas with kind eyes and spoke softly. "Thomas, you've been protecting my family for many years. You've stood guard in storms and heat waves, and you've never once complained. I think you've earned the right to be honest with me." Thomas looked surprised. Most nobles rarely spoke to guards about personal matters. The prince's words seemed to touch something deep inside him. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time he let his pain show on his face. "Your Highness, I haven't been sleeping well lately," Thomas admitted quietly. "My wife Margaret, she's been very sick. The doctor says she might not get better." His voice broke a little as he spoke. Alexander felt his heart sink. He had met Margaret several times at palace celebrations. She was a sweet woman who always smiled and brought homemade bread to the guards' families during holidays. The thought of her being seriously ill made Alexander sad and worried. "I've been staying up all night taking care of her," Thomas continued. "I give her medicine, make sure she's comfortable, and try to keep her spirits up. Then I come straight to work without any rest. I can't afford to miss work, Your Highness. Margaret's medicine is expensive, and we need every coin I earn." Now Alexander understood why Thomas looked so terrible. The poor man had been working all day and caring for his sick wife all night for who knows how long. No wonder he was swaying on his feet and struggling to stay alert. "How long has this been going on?" Alexander asked gently. "About 3 weeks now," Thomas replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "At first I thought I could handle it. I'm strong and I've worked long hours before. But lately everything feels like it's spinning, and sometimes I can't remember things clearly." Alexander was amazed that Thomas had managed to keep working under such difficult conditions. But he was also worried about what might happen if the guard collapsed while on duty. Thomas could get seriously hurt, and it might also put the palace's security at risk. "Thomas, have you told anyone else about this?" the prince asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, Your Highness. Captain Marcus has been very strict lately about guards being at their best. 3 guards were dismissed last month for small mistakes. I can't risk losing my job, especially now when Margaret needs her medicine." Alexander now understood the full problem. Thomas was trapped between his love for his wife and his fear of losing his job. He was sacrificing his own health to take care of Margaret and keep earning money. But this couldn't continue much longer without serious consequences. The prince thought about the captain of the guards, Marcus. The man was known for being tough and demanding perfection from his soldiers. While this usually made the palace safer, it also meant that guards were afraid to show any weakness or ask for help when they needed it. "Thomas, what if I could help you without Captain Marcus knowing about it?" Alexander asked carefully. Thomas looked confused and hopeful at the same time. "I don't understand, Your Highness. How could you help?" Alexander had an idea forming in his mind, but he needed to think it through carefully. He couldn't just give Thomas money directly, as that might offend the proud guard. He also couldn't simply excuse Thomas from his duties without a good explanation that wouldn't get him in trouble. "Let me ask you something," Alexander said. "If you could get some rest and still earn your wages, would that help?" "Of course it would, Your Highness, but I don't see how that's possible," Thomas replied. Alexander smiled slightly. "What if there was a special assignment that required you to work different hours? Something that would let you sleep during the day and be with Margaret at night?" Thomas's eyes widened. "Is there such an assignment?" "There might be," Alexander said mysteriously. "But first I need to know more about Margaret's condition. What exactly is wrong with her?" Thomas looked around nervously to make sure no one else was listening. "The doctor says she has a fever that won't go away, and she's getting weaker every day. Her stomach hurts and she can't keep food down. We've tried all the medicine the village doctor has, but nothing seems to work." Alexander felt even more concerned. This sounded like a serious illness that might need better medical care than what was available in the village. The palace had the kingdom's best doctors, but they usually only treated the royal family and high-ranking nobles. "Thomas, would Margaret be willing to see the palace physician?" Alexander asked. Thomas looked shocked. "Your Highness, we could never afford such a thing. The royal doctor charges more for one visit than I earn in a month." "What if it didn't cost anything?" Alexander asked with a small smile. Thomas stared at the prince in disbelief. I don't understand. Why would you help us like this?" Alexander put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Because you've been loyal to my family and because it's the right thing to do. Good people shouldn't suffer when help is available." For the first time since their conversation began, Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He had been carrying this burden alone for weeks, and now suddenly, someone was offering to help. He was overwhelmed by the prince's kindness and generosity. Alexander spent the rest of the morning thinking about how to help Thomas without causing problems. He attended his usual lessons with his tutor, but his mind kept wandering to the loyal guard and his sick wife. During lunch with his parents, the king and queen, Alexander decided to test an idea. "Father," Alexander said carefully, "I've been thinking about the palace security. Don't you think it would be good to have guards who watch over things at different times? Maybe during the night?" King Edward looked up from his meal with interest. "What do you mean, son?" "Well, most of our guards work during the day when there are many people around. But what about late at night when everyone is sleeping? Wouldn't it be smart to have some guards who are fresh and alert during those quiet hours?" The Queen, Isabella, smiled at her son. "That's very thoughtful of you, Alexander. Are you worried about something specific?" Alexander chose his words carefully. "Not worried exactly, but I've been reading about other kingdoms that have night patrols. It seems like a wise idea. Maybe we could try it with some of our most experienced guards." King Edward nodded slowly. "You know, that's not a bad suggestion. Captain Marcus has mentioned that some guards seem tired during their day shifts. Maybe rotating some of them to night duty would help everyone stay more alert." Alexander's heart jumped with excitement, but he tried to stay calm. "Could I suggest which guards might be good for this new night duty?" "I suppose you could make recommendations," the king said. "You've been observing the guards for years. You probably know their strengths well." After lunch, Alexander went to find Dr. Harrison, the palace physician. Dr. Harrison was a kind, elderly man who had been taking care of the royal family for over 20 years. Alexander had always liked him because he explained things clearly and never talked down to him. "Dr. Harrison, may I ask you something?" Alexander said when he found the doctor in his office. "Of course, Your Highness. Are you feeling unwell?" "No, I'm fine. But I wanted to ask about helping sick people who aren't part of the royal family. Is that something you would be willing to do?" Dr. Harrison looked curious. "Well, I do help others sometimes, especially in emergencies." "Why do you ask?" Alexander explained about Thomas and his wife, being careful not to mention that Thomas had been struggling at work. He described Margaret's symptoms and how worried Thomas was about her condition. Dr. Harrison listened carefully and nodded. Those symptoms could be several different things, some serious and some not. It would be important to examine her properly to know for sure. Many illnesses that seem terrible can actually be treated quite easily with the right medicine. "Would you be willing to see her?" Alexander asked hopefully. "For one of our loyal guards? Of course, Thomas has always been respectful and dutiful." "I'd be happy to help his family." Alexander felt relieved. The first part of his plan was working. Now he needed to talk to his father about the night guard duty and make sure Thomas would be chosen for it. That evening, Alexander approached his father in the royal study. King Edward was reading reports and seemed to be in a good mood. "Father, I've been thinking more about the night guard idea we discussed," Alexander said. "Oh yes, I spoke with Captain Marcus about it this afternoon. He thinks it's an excellent suggestion. We're going to start next week with a few experienced guards. I was hoping to recommend Thomas for this duty," Alexander said. "He's been with us for 10 years and he's always been reliable. I think he would do well with the responsibility of night patrol." King Edward smiled. "You know, I've noticed Thomas too. He's a good man, very dedicated." "I think that's a fine recommendation, Alexander. I'll tell Captain Marcus to assign Thomas to the new night shift." Alexander could barely contain his excitement. Thomas would now be able to sleep during the day and be with Margaret at night, which was exactly what he needed. Plus, he would still earn his full wages. The next morning, Alexander found Thomas at his usual post. The guard still looked tired, but he seemed a bit better than the day before. "Thomas, I have some good news," Alexander said quietly. "Good news, Your Highness? First, Dr. Harrison has agreed to examine Margaret. He can see her this afternoon if that works for you." Thomas's face lit up with hope and gratitude. "Dr. Harrison? The royal physician? Your Highness, I don't know how to thank you." "There's more," Alexander continued. "My father has decided to create a new night guard patrol, and you've been chosen to lead it. You'll work from sunset to sunrise, which means you can sleep during the day." Thomas stared at the prince in amazement. "Night duty? But that's perfect. I could be with Margaret during her worst hours and still do my job properly." "Exactly," Alexander said with a smile. "Captain Marcus will give you the details later today." "The new schedule starts next week." Thomas's eyes filled with tears again. "Your Highness, you've saved my life and Margaret's. I don't understand why you're being so kind to us." Alexander thought for a moment before answering. "My father always tells me that a king's greatest strength comes from the loyalty and well-being of his people. You've been loyal to our family for 10 years, Thomas. Now it's our turn to be loyal to you. Thomas nodded, too emotional to speak. He straightened up and saluted the prince with more energy than Alexander had seen from him in days. As Alexander walked away, he felt proud of what he had accomplished. He had solved Thomas's immediate problems without embarrassing him or getting him in trouble. But more importantly, he had learned something valuable about leadership and taking care of people who serve you. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison made his way to the small cottage where Thomas and Margaret lived. Alexander had insisted on going with him, curious to see how his plan was working and genuinely concerned about Margaret's health. The cottage was tiny but very clean and well kept. Margaret lay in bed looking pale and weak, but she tried to sit up when she saw the royal physician and the prince entering her home. "Please don't get up," Dr. Harrison said kindly. "I'm here to help you feel better." Margaret looked confused and worried. "Thomas, we can't afford this. Why did you bring the royal doctor here?" Thomas took his wife's hand gently. "Don't worry about the cost, my love. His Highness has arranged everything." Dr. Harrison began his examination, asking Margaret questions about her symptoms and how long she had been feeling unwell. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, and felt her stomach carefully. Alexander watched quietly from the corner of the room. He could see how much Thomas and Margaret loved each other by the way they looked at one another. Margaret was clearly very sick, but she kept trying to smile and act strong for her husband's sake. After a thorough examination, Dr. Harrison sat down beside the bed with a serious but hopeful expression. "Margaret, I have good news and challenging news," he said. "The good news is that I know exactly what's wrong with you, and it can be completely cured." Margaret and Thomas both looked relieved and anxious at the same time. "You have what we call marsh fever," Dr. Harrison continued. "It's caused by bad water or spoiled food, and it's quite common in areas near the old swamp behind the village. The challenging news is that you need special medicine that must be taken for several weeks." "What kind of medicine?" Thomas asked. Dr. Harrison opened his medical bag and pulled out several small bottles. "These herbs come from the southern kingdoms. They're expensive because they have to travel so far, but they work very well. You'll need to take this mixture 3 times a day with clean water." Margaret looked worried. "Dr. Harrison, we're grateful for your help, but Thomas has already told you we can't afford expensive medicine." Alexander stepped forward. "Margaret, please don't worry about the cost. This is my gift to you and Thomas for all the years of loyal service." Margaret began to cry, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Your Highness, you're so young to be so wise and kind. How can we ever repay such generosity?" "By getting well and letting Thomas take good care of you," Alexander replied with a warm smile. Dr. Harrison spent the next hour explaining exactly how to prepare and take the medicine. He also gave Margaret specific instructions about what foods to eat and avoid while she was recovering. "The most important thing," Dr. Harrison said, "is that you need complete rest for at least 2 weeks. Thomas, you'll need to make sure she stays in bed and doesn't try to do any housework or cooking." Thomas nodded seriously. "I'll take care of everything, Doctor. My new work schedule will let me be here during the day." Dr. Harrison looked puzzled. "New work schedule?" Alexander explained about the night guard duty, and Dr. Harrison smiled approvingly. "That's perfect timing. Margaret will need the most care during the day when the medicine might make her feel tired or dizzy." Before leaving, Dr. Harrison gave Thomas a list of warning signs to watch for and promised to return in 3 days to check on Margaret's progress. As they walked back to the palace, Dr. Harrison spoke to Alexander privately. "Your Highness, what you've done today shows great wisdom and compassion. That young man was heading for a complete breakdown from exhaustion, and his wife could have become much sicker without proper treatment." "Do you think she'll get completely better?" Alexander asked. "Oh yes, marsh fever responds very well to treatment when caught in time. She should be feeling much better within a week and completely recovered within a month." Alexander felt a huge weight lift from his shoulders. He had been more worried about Margaret than he had realized. That evening, Captain Marcus came to speak with Thomas about his new assignment. Alexander happened to be nearby and listened to the conversation. "Thomas, you've been selected for a special new duty," Captain Marcus said in his usual stern voice. "Night patrol is very important work. You'll be responsible for watching the entire palace grounds from sunset to sunrise." "Yes, sir. I understand," Thomas replied. "This is not easier work, it's different work," Captain Marcus continued. You'll be alone for most of your shift, so you need to be extra alert. Can you handle this responsibility? Thomas stood straighter than Alexander had seen him in weeks. Yes, sir. I won't let you down. Good. You start tomorrow night. Report to the main gate at sunset and I'll show you the patrol route. After Captain Marcus left, Thomas found Alexander in the garden. Your Highness, I wanted you to know that Margaret took her first dose of medicine an hour ago. She's already sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Alexander smiled. That's wonderful news, Thomas. I also wanted to promise you something, Thomas said seriously. I will be the best night guard this palace has ever had. I'll prove that your faith in me was well placed. I already know you will, Alexander replied. You've been proving your worth for 10 years. As Alexander went to bed that night, he felt proud of what he had accomplished. He had learned that being a leader wasn't just about giving orders or making big decisions. Sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was notice when someone needed help and find a way to provide it quietly and with dignity. 3 days later, Alexander was eager to hear how Thomas's first nights on patrol had gone. He also wanted to check on Margaret's recovery. As the sun was setting, he made his way to the main gate where Thomas was beginning his night shift. Thomas looked like a completely different person. His face had color again, his eyes were bright and alert, and he stood tall and strong. The transformation was remarkable. Good evening, Your Highness, Thomas said with a genuine smile. What brings you out at this hour? I wanted to see how your new duties are going. Alexander replied. You look much better. I feel like a new man, Thomas said with enthusiasm. I've been able to sleep for 6 hours each day and I spend my evenings with Margaret. She's improving so quickly that Dr. Harrison says she might be completely well in just 2 more weeks. Alexander felt delighted to hear this good news. And how do you like the night patrol? Thomas's eyes lit up. Your Highness, I love it. The palace is so peaceful at night, and I feel like I'm really protecting something important. I've already discovered some things that the day guards never noticed. What kind of things? Alexander asked with interest. Well, there's a loose stone in the west wall that could be a security risk. And I found that one of the garden gates doesn't lock properly. Also, there are some wild animals that come near the palace at night. Mostly harmless, but good to know about. Alexander was impressed. Thomas was taking his new responsibilities very seriously, and was already making the palace safer. Captain Marcus seems pleased with your work too, Alexander said. I heard him telling my father that the night patrol was an excellent idea. Thomas beamed with pride. Thank you for making this possible, Your Highness. I know you arranged all of this to help me, and I want you to know it's working perfectly. As they talked, another guard approached. It was William, one of the younger guards who had always looked up to Thomas. Thomas, I wanted to ask you about the night duty, William said. Captain Marcus is thinking of adding more guards to the night shift. Would you recommend it? Thomas thought for a moment. It's different from day duty, William. You have to be comfortable being alone and staying alert when everything is quiet. But it's good work, and I think some of the other guards might enjoy the change. William nodded. My wife is expecting our first child soon, and the night shift would let me help her during the day. Do you think I could handle it? I think you'd do well, Thomas said kindly. If you want, you can walk part of my patrol route tonight and see what it's like. Alexander watched this exchange with interest. Thomas was already becoming a leader among the guards, sharing his knowledge and helping others. The night patrol wasn't just helping Thomas and Margaret, it was creating new opportunities for other guards too. After William left to continue his own duties, Alexander walked with Thomas for part of his patrol route. The palace grounds looked different at night, more mysterious and beautiful. The moon cast silver shadows through the trees and the air was cool and fresh. Thomas, can I ask you something? Alexander said as they walked. Were you angry when you were struggling before? Did you feel like no one cared about the guards? Thomas considered the question carefully. I wasn't angry, Your Highness. I was scared and exhausted, but not angry. I knew that everyone has their own responsibilities and problems. I just didn't know how to ask for help without seeming weak. But asking for help isn't weak, Alexander said. It's smart. I know that now, Thomas replied. But when you're a guard, you're trained to never show weakness. We're supposed to be strong and reliable all the time. Sometimes that training makes it hard to admit when you need support. This gave Alexander an idea. What if there was a way for guards to get help when they needed it, without having to admit weakness publicly? Thomas looked curious. What do you mean? I'm not sure yet, Alexander said thoughtfully. But maybe there should be someone that guards could talk to privately when they have problems. Someone who could help solve issues before they become serious. That would be wonderful, Thomas said. There have been times when other guards had problems, family troubles, money worries, injuries they were afraid to report. Most of them suffered in silence because they didn't want to lose their jobs. Alexander made a mental note to think more about this idea. Maybe he could suggest it to his father as another improvement to the palace guard system. As they completed the patrol route, Thomas showed Alexander all the places he checked each night: the gates, the walls, the stables, and the treasure room. Thomas explained how he varied his timing so that anyone watching wouldn't be able to predict exactly when he would appear at each location. You've really thought this through, Alexander observed. Night security is different from day security, Thomas explained. During the day, there are so many people around that trouble would be noticed quickly. At night, an intruder might have hours to work without being seen, unless the guard is very careful and thorough. When they returned to the main gate, Alexander felt satisfied that Thomas was not only recovering well, but was actually thriving in his new role. The guard who had been struggling silently just a week ago was now confident, healthy, and doing excellent work. Thomas, I'm proud of how well you're handling all of this, Alexander said. You've turned a difficult situation into something positive. Your Highness, you saved my family and my career. More than that, you treated me with respect and dignity when I needed help most. I'll never forget that kindness. As Alexander headed back to the palace, he realized that helping Thomas had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, compassion, and the importance of paying attention to the people around him. He was beginning to understand what kind of king he wanted to become. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret began her treatment, and Alexander was delighted to hear that she had made a complete recovery. Dr. Harrison had pronounced her fully healed, and she was back to her normal activities. Thomas continued to excel in his night duties, and Captain Marcus had indeed expanded the night patrol to include 3 more guards. Alexander's experience with Thomas had changed how he looked at everyone in the palace. He began paying more attention to the servants, guards, and workers, noticing things he had never seen before. He observed when someone looked tired, worried, or stressed, and he started to understand that many people in the palace had challenges they kept hidden. One morning, Alexander approached his father with a new idea. Father, I've been thinking about ways to make our palace run even better, Alexander said during their daily walk in the garden. What do you have in mind? King Edward asked, always interested in his son's ideas. I think we should have someone whose job is to listen to the concerns of our workers and guards, someone they could talk to privately when they have problems, without worrying about getting in trouble. King Edward stopped walking and looked at his son thoughtfully. That's an interesting idea. What made you think of it? Alexander chose his words carefully. I've been watching our people more closely lately, and I've realized that sometimes they have difficulties that affect their work, but they're afraid to ask for help. If we could solve small problems early, we might prevent bigger problems later. Give me an example, the king said. Well, what if a guard's child was sick and he needed to leave work for a few hours? Right now, he might not tell anyone and just try to work while worried. But if he could explain the situation to someone understanding, maybe we could arrange for another guard to cover for him temporarily. King Edward nodded slowly. So you're suggesting we create a position for someone who helps solve personal problems that might affect work performance? Exactly. And it would show our people that we care about them as individuals, not just as workers. The king smiled proudly at his son. Alexander, that's a very mature and wise suggestion. Who do you think should handle this responsibility? Alexander had already thought about this. What about Sir Edmund? He's retired from active duty but still lives in the palace. He's experienced, trustworthy, and people respect him. Plus, he's kind and good at listening. Sir Edmund was a former captain of the guards who had served the royal family for 30 years before retiring due to an old injury. He was known for his fairness and wisdom. That's an excellent choice, King Edward agreed. Sir Edmund has always been good with people, and his experience would help him understand the challenges our workers face. That afternoon, Alexander and his father met with Sir Edmund to discuss the new position. The old knight was honored to be asked and immediately understood the importance of the role. Your Majesty, I think this is a wonderful idea, Sir Edmund said. In my years as captain, I saw many good people struggle with problems that could have been solved easily if they had felt comfortable asking for help. What would you need to do this job effectively? King Edward asked. Sir Edmund thought for a moment. I would need a private office where people could come to talk without others overhearing. I would also need your assurance that I could keep conversations confidential, unless there was a serious safety concern. Both of those can be arranged, the king said. Alexander, since this was your idea, would you like to help Sir Edmund get started? Alexander was thrilled. Yes, father. I'd be honored to help. Over the next few days, Alexander worked with Sir Edmund to set up the new system. They arranged a comfortable office near the guards' quarters where people could come to talk. They also created simple rules about confidentiality, and when Sir Edmund might need to involve Captain Marcus or the king. Word spread quickly through the palace about the new arrangement. At first, some people were suspicious, wondering if it was a trick to get them to reveal their problems. But Sir Edmund's reputation for fairness and kindness gradually overcame their doubts. The first person to visit Sir Edmund was a young kitchen maid named Sarah. She had been making mistakes in her work because she was worried about her elderly father who lived alone in the village. Sir Edmund arranged for Sarah to visit her father during her afternoon break and found an older servant who was happy to check on the old man regularly. Next came a stable boy who had been struggling to read the written instructions for caring for the horses. Sir Edmund quietly arranged for one of the scribes to give the boy reading lessons during slow periods. Then William, the guard who had asked Thomas about night duty, came to Sir Edmund with concerns about his pregnant wife. Sir Edmund worked with Captain Marcus to adjust William's schedule so he could be home when his wife needed him most. Alexander watched these developments with great satisfaction. The new system was working exactly as he had hoped. People were getting help with their problems, and their work was improving as a result. One evening, as Alexander was finishing his studies, Thomas approached him in the library. Your Highness, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, Thomas said. But more than that, I wanted you to know that what you started has helped many people beyond just me and Margaret. What do you mean? Alexander asked. The other guards have been talking. They're saying that the prince really cares about the people who serve him. Word has spread to the servants and stable workers too. Everyone feels more valued and respected, Thomas continued. William told me that his wife feels much better knowing that he can be home when the baby comes. Sarah in the kitchen is much happier now that she doesn't have to worry about her father, and there are others who have been helped quietly by Sir Edmund. Alexander felt a warm glow of satisfaction. I'm glad it's working well. But the most important thing, Thomas said seriously, is that people now know that if they have problems, they don't have to suffer alone. That gives everyone hope and makes them want to do their best work. Alexander realized that what had started as a simple desire to help one struggling guard had grown into something much larger, a new way of showing that the royal family truly cared about all the people who served them. Thomas, can I ask you something? Alexander said thoughtfully. Do you think other kingdoms treat their people this way? Thomas shook his head. From what I've heard from traveling merchants and visiting guards, no. Most places, if you can't do your job perfectly, you're simply replaced. There's no understanding that people are human beings with families and problems. This made Alexander think about the kind of leader he wanted to be when he became king. He was learning that true strength came not from demanding perfection, but from helping people be their best. Your Highness, Thomas said, there's something else I wanted to tell you. Margaret and I have been talking, and we want to name our next child after you, if that would be acceptable. Alexander was deeply moved by this honor. Thomas, that would mean more to me than you know. We hope to have good news about that soon, Thomas said with a smile. Margaret says that being healthy again has given her hope for the future in ways she hadn't dared to dream about when she was sick. As Thomas left the library, Alexander sat quietly thinking about everything that had happened. A month ago, he had been just a young prince learning lessons from books and tutors. Now he felt like he truly understood what it meant to be a leader who cared for his people. He thought about his father and how proud King Edward had been of the new support system they had created. He thought about Sir Edmund, who was finding new purpose in helping others. He thought about all the guards, servants, and workers who now felt more secure and valued. Most of all, he thought about Thomas and Margaret. whose love and dedication had taught him that sometimes the most important leadership decisions were the quiet, personal ones that nobody else would ever know about. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same spot in the palace gardens where he had first noticed Thomas struggling. But now everything was different. The morning sun shone on a palace that felt more alive and harmonious than ever before. Thomas walked by on his way home from his night shift, looking healthy and content. He waved respectfully to Alexander, and the prince could see the genuine happiness in his eyes. Margaret had indeed recovered completely and was expecting their first child. True to their word, they had asked Alexander to be the child's godfather, an honor that filled him with joy and responsibility. The night patrol system had become so successful that other kingdoms had sent representatives to learn about it. Captain Marcus, who had initially been skeptical of changes, now proudly showed visitors how the new system worked. The palace had never been more secure, and the guards had never been happier with their work. Sir Edmund's office had become a cornerstone of palace life. Almost every week someone came to him with a concern that could be solved before it became a serious problem. The old knight had even started holding informal meetings where workers could suggest improvements to make the palace run more smoothly. Many excellent ideas had come from these discussions. Alexander had learned to make his morning walks through the gardens a time for really observing the people around him. He noticed when someone seemed worried or stressed, and he had become skilled at finding gentle ways to ensure they got help. His reputation for caring about his people had spread throughout the kingdom. The young prince had also started a tradition of monthly meetings with representatives from different groups of palace workers, guards, kitchen staff, stable hands, gardeners, and others. These meetings gave everyone a voice in how things were run and made sure that good ideas could come from anywhere. King Edward often spoke proudly about his son's growth and wisdom. Alexander has learned something that many rulers never understand, he told Queen Isabella. True leadership isn't about commanding people. It's about serving them and helping them succeed. One particularly meaningful change was that other guards had started following Thomas's example of looking out for each other. When someone seemed to be struggling, their fellow guards would quietly offer support or suggest they talk to Sir Edmund. The culture of suffering in silence had been replaced by one of mutual care and assistance. Dr. Harrison had also benefited from the changes. The king had asked him to establish regular health checkups for all palace workers, not just the royal family. This meant that illnesses like Margaret's could be caught and treated early, keeping everyone healthier and more productive. Word of the palace's new approach had reached other noble families, and many had begun implementing similar systems. Alexander felt proud that his small act of compassion for one guard had started a movement that was helping people throughout the kingdom. As Alexander stood in the garden that morning, reflecting on all these changes, a young page approached him nervously. "Your Highness," the boy said hesitantly, "may I speak with you about something?" Alexander smiled kindly, remembering how this all began. "Of course. What's troubling you?" The page looked around nervously, then said quietly, "It's my sister, Your Highness. She works in the laundry, and she's been having trouble keeping up with her work. She's afraid to say anything because she doesn't want to lose her position." "What kind of trouble?" Alexander asked gently. "She can't see very well, Your Highness. Things look blurry to her, especially small details, but she's trying her best to hide it." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Have you heard about Sir Edmund's office?" The page's face brightened. "Yes, Your Highness. Everyone knows about Sir Edmund. Do you think he could help my sister?" "I think he definitely could," Alexander said. "Dr. Harrison might be able to help with her vision problem, and if she needs special assistance with her work, that can probably be arranged too." The young page looked relieved and grateful. "Thank you, Your Highness. I'll tell her to go see Sir Edmund today." As the page hurried away, Alexander felt the same satisfaction he had experienced when helping Thomas. He realized that the system they had created was now working automatically, helping people without him having to be directly involved every time. Thomas appeared again, having finished checking in with the day guards. He approached Alexander with something in his hand. "Your Highness, I have something for you," Thomas said, holding out a small wooden carving. "I made this during my breaks. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember what we accomplished together." Alexander took the carving and examined it carefully, It was a beautiful miniature of the palace gate, expertly crafted with tiny details. On the base, Thomas had carved the words, "Compassion is the truest strength." "Thomas, this is wonderful," Alexander said, genuinely moved. "I'll treasure it always. Your Highness, I wanted you to know that Margaret and I have decided on a name for our baby. If it's a boy, we'll call him Alexander. If it's a girl, we'll name her Alexandria." Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes. "I'm honored beyond words, Thomas." As Alexander walked back toward the palace holding the wooden carving, he thought about the future. Someday he would be king, and he would face many difficult decisions, but he now knew that the most important principle would always be to notice when people needed help and to find ways to provide it with dignity and respect. The wooden carving would sit on his desk for the rest of his life, reminding him that leadership wasn't about power or privilege. It was about using those gifts to make life better for everyone around him. And it all began with simply paying attention to one loyal guard who was struggling quietly at his post, trying to do his duty despite personal pain. The palace had become more than just a beautiful building. It had become a community where people cared for each other. And that, Alexander realized, was the greatest treasure any kingdom could have.